Welcome to this session on livestock into arable systems. My name's Johnnie Balfour, Chair of Pasture for Life and a farmer in Fife, Balburney Home Farms. We have both livestock and arable. On the panel today we have Jo Franklin, who is a neighbour of the Cherries just along here and has her Kaipoi sheep, which the stand is just opposite. You can go and see them afterwards, and some arable too. We have James Edwards, who is struggling after a heavy night last night and is a sheep grazer in the south of England. And on the far side we have Alec Brewster, who's also struggling after a heavy night and is a livestock farmer in Perthshire in Scotland who takes his animals down the hill to a relatively near neighbour who's got an arable farm. I'm going to start by asking each of these three panelists to just give an outline of their what they think the biggest advantages are of being able to have livestock in an arable system from each of their points of view. So, Jo.
Good morning. I went home and looked after my children last night, so I feel fine. So I'll probably command the stage a bit more. We are, as I said, neighbours from here. We're 2,000 acres of arable, 2,500 Romneys. 300 of those are milking sheep. So we have a sheep dairy, and we are just continuously trying to close the loop on our farm. We don't claim the regen badge. We aim for as sustainable as we possibly can be. So any opportunity to use something from our own system or add something from our own system rather than buy something in, and that's where we're interested. So the sheep came on to graze the cover crops. That's where they started, and we've just expanded that. There's probably nothing we haven't tried eating with sheep. In the drought last year, for those of you that were here last year when it was 40 degrees and looked like the Sahara, in that year we were grazing borage after it had been combined. We were that sort of desperate, but we never reached for the bag because that's just too many. We couldn't even feed them all in a day if we wanted to. So there's lots and lots of synergies between having the sheep and having the arable, and now with the dairy. So we make our own feed up out of the bits that don't get onto the lorry for the dairy. The Romneys, as I say, will graze the cover crops, and we're quite strict about pen sizes and things like that so that we can actually measure the amount of manure. It's a best guess, it's not perfect, which is very upsetting to true arable farmers. They like perfect, but we also use N testers and N sensors and other gadgets on that side to help even out what we're doing with the sheep over the winter. So it's an appreciable amount that we can actually knock off our nitrogen bill, which you can come and talk to us about on the stand later, or I can give you some figures of how we worked it all out. But it really does start to make sense. So the sheep get clean grazing for the winter, so we really don't struggle too badly with wormy pasture that they lamb on because we're off it for half the year. So it's half the year behind permanent fence on old country estates, which there are many around here, and then half the year on any old cover crop we can get our hands on. And not every sheep is right for that system. Ours are bred for it. We're the only arable breeders doing that job, so they are primed for it. They understand electric, and that's probably our synergies.
Fantastic, thank you. James.
Hello. So firstly, I apologise to anybody that I met from about midnight last night. But it was very lovely. I had a wonderful time. So I'm not an arable farmer, just a sheep grazier. So originally I came from Wales, where I'm from, very, very little arable. But it was a case of dead man's shoes. Trying to get access to ground was almost impossible, very expensive. So I moved south and east. Went Hampshire, West Berkshire first, and then now we've ended up sort of through the southeast of England all the way down to Essex. And the main reason for going east is obviously it's the land of the combine. So at the time that, about 10 years ago when I moved that way, there weren't very many people doing sort of sheep and livestock in Arable, so there was a huge opportunity. Lots of people want to put in herbal lays, lots of people putting in grass breaks to do with sort of black grass and fertility building, and obviously lots of cover crops. So the main reason I got into the livestock and arable thing was just sort of opportunity of access. And now we run quite a lot of sheep sort of around the southeast England, pretty much from West Berkshire down to the coast of Essex. And apart from sort of a big conservation grazing block, nearly all our ground is on arable estates. And we graze a lot of cover crops in the winter with store lambs, and we also graze sort of standing cereals, herbal lays, and other bits like that. So that's kind of the biggest thing for me is just it allows me to run a efficient, cheap sheep system, not owning any ground, not coming from a farming background, and not actually owning a farm. So we've got all of our livestock are on 12-month short-term lets. So.
Brilliant, thank you.
Good morning. So I'm from central Perthshire, Scotland, Dunkeld. We've got a couple of farming operations up there, primarily beef and sheep, breeding operations, and then we have been working with in the arable sector the last 4 to 5 years with James Hopkins at Arable Ventures. He provides arable land to us, and then over that we've been running young ewe lambs, sort of bringing them through the winter, and with James, he sets up the arable rotations, what he's wanting to do, and then we come in behind, fence up, and we move between cover crops, winter wheats, a wee bit kind of grass margins, and a bit of EFA. And we just pick and choose what we graze, when we graze, depending on the growth stage of the plants, depending on the weather and what's happening around about us. And we just keep flicking the fencing around, I suppose, a wee bit, just to pick and choose so there's no compromise to the arable operation. But also it allows us to grow these lambs on really well. And Joe touched on the fact there's a low parasite burden. I think for us, that's the biggest thing, that we're really allowing these lambs to grow and express their genetic potential because they're never actually getting held up by an internal burden. And that's probably one of the bigger wins of moving sheep round an arable operation for us.
And from your point of view as grazers, what do you feel is the biggest benefit to the arable partner in those agreements?
I mean, I think when we started, we obviously quite a big knowledge of grazing grasslands and how to manage them, how to get the best in the pasture, how to build covers, root depths, build biology within the soils. So we've taken that knowledge from a hillside and then kind of dropped into an arable operation. And then the arable operation is developed to, it's pretty much no-till. And then the guys have brought in a stripper header. And I think from my point of view, that's made the biggest difference to how we graze and how we get across the landscape, and that the stubbles are sort of run down by the direct drills that comes through. It puts a cap above the soil. So when we're actually grazing these cereals or covers or a wee bit oilseed rate, but we're a wee bit nervous about just how we do that so we don't compromise yield at all. The biggest thing is keeping the sheep's feet up off the ground. And that stubble bent down, it kind of creates a shield to the soil, obviously. The lambs don't actually graze through it. It keeps their feet up. It keeps the sheep super clean. But then when we move on again, even though we've taken off probably 50% of the residual plant that was there, the plant's then protected from any wind shear, frost. There's no real nutrient leaching or water runoff because all that's got held and trapped within and under that stubble, which then seems to break down really well. The plant then recovers really quickly from the grazing, and I think that's more to do with how that stubble's getting laid down, and then it's just nurtured. I think that's the best way I can describe that. Young plant is just nurtured, and then tillers out, and we come back around 4 to 6 weeks later. We're not regrazing it, but you go back and look at the regrowth 4 to 6 weeks later, you'd hardly know we've actually been there in the first place, such as the speed of recovery of the cereal.
So where we are, a lot of it is cost. So we kind of live in the same with Joe, like big arable. So there's a lot of big estates putting in thousands of acres of cover crops, and obviously pre-grazing them with livestock, they've got to get rid of them somehow. So there's desiccation of crops, topping of crops, spraying them off, and they still sometimes have to do that to some extent. But obviously it's a lot lower rate of Roundup. It's a lot less diesel burn topping. It's a lot less man hours going up and down a tractor. And some of these estates that we go onto are really, really big. So that's that's a major cost to them. So us putting livestock on, it's not only kind of obviously increasing soil fertility and building organic matter and that stuff, but it is just saving them like straight up costs in getting rid of the cover crops which they've planted, and they obviously then get we pay for a lot of our sort of like cover crops, not a huge amount, but over several thousand sheep over the winter, it is quite a nice check for something that you used to be spending money to do, and so that's that's a big thing for a lot of our landlords. They do quite like the money and not having to spend money. Do you know what I mean? So that's a big driver, I think, for a lot of our areas.
And Joe as well, would you echo that from sitting on both sides of the fence?
Yeah, it's certainly the other thing we haven't touched on is countryside stewardship and SFI and those areas. And as somebody that sits with all the enterprises around us, it opens the door to so many more of those options and things you can do to be able to have the sheep and the arable all going around together. It just, the scheme is really made for it. So you can very quickly get into tens of thousands that can come at you from those schemes just because you've got the ability to graze them, and they're not thinking, you're not having to think, oh, I've got to, as James said, I've not got to top it, I've not got to deal with it that way. So yeah, they do save money. They save money on fur, they save money on chems, on that side. There's no argument that they're great, you're going to solve your blackgrass problems, because that's just not true. You need to be doing that from a large, yeah. But it's been touted about, and it's just not true. But
Don't tell them that.
Well, Mrs. Honesty me. But it does get that soil life. Everybody's talking about soil life. People are trying to sell you things to put on to help your soil life. Well, you might not have an awful lot there. When I came back from my Nuffield, I did microscope assays on I was an agronomist then, and I did a lot of my customers' soils, and they had the worst soil I did had zero. No life, no bacteria, no fungi. Over the last 50 years, they managed to smash the hell out of the whole lot. So it's all very well you can go and feed it, but if it's not there, it's not going to work. So a lot of what we're being sold now, and there are good things in there, but if you haven't got any soil life, it can't work. So we're all assuming we have, but we have the sheep go around our arable every other year. So the difference that is making to what's living below the surface is phenomenal. And then you see the best of these products, things like the Tyros seed treatment, we get fantastic return out of because we've got great soil life, where other people see almost nothing. So that will benefit us to the tune of 30 kilos of nitrogen. Well, if the sheep are giving us 30 and that's giving us 30, we're starting to make really big inroads in how much we're putting on. So there are lots of things you can do, and it's the synergy of the whole lot. We all know what our grandfathers did, and they did it for a reason, and it was a good reason. And we need to use modern methods to get back to that circle of life without lorry after lorry bringing us products in that we don't really know what they're doing.
You touched on earlier on, like a lot of, obviously I've been around a lot of your ground, and you've got a lot of quite large country estates. And a lot of arable estates in this area, or a lot of estates, have a chunk of crap grass that they've never really known what to do with. It's been a pain in the arse, they've had to top it, it's been almost a cost to them, but it's perhaps not been enough for anybody to do anything sensible with. So putting that, 100 acres of permanent pasture with some cover crops, with a herbal lay kind of like break, then that starts fleshing out to something where they can attract somebody in to start to sort of form a business there. Because it's all very well having loads of cover crops and being like, oh, we want 5,000 sheep to graze them off in the winter. But they've got to come from somewhere, and there's a cost bringing them up and down. So by putting in sort of a year-round grass, or taking advantage of this sort of crappy permanent pasture that a lot of them got, it allows there to be livestock in the area. Because this is one of the biggest problems in the East. We've got all these estates say we want livestock, preferably 6 weeks a year or 8 weeks a year, but we've got to get them from somewhere, and they're quite a long way. And then we've got to get people who can manage them. We've got to get all that sort of stuff. So things like the GS4 schemes and all that sort of stuff, it's all kind of tied in really nicely together to allow to flesh out a picture of people being able to build a livestock business in it, rather than just nipping in, doing a bit of grazing and going away again, which has meant it's more available, because lots of parts of the country you can't just nip into and nip away from. If you're bringing sheep from Wales to Lincolnshire, you kind of don't want to be there for 3 weeks, so it's, yeah.
And Alec, what would you feel are the key ways that you need to manage your livestock so that you're doing the right thing by the land that you're grazing on?
I think firstly you understand how the plant operates. And once you've got your head wrapped around how many days you can actually graze a set area for, we tend to set up sort of 20, 10 to 15, 20 hectare blocks at a time. We subdivide these down. We're always on the move, so the fencing systems we're putting in place we're building them off the back of the Polaris. They're temporary. We're knocking them up, stripping them down. The lambs get really used to the system very, very quickly, and I think that's the misnomer that people have that when you go into any rotational grazing system that the stock won't understand. The stock, whether it's beef or sheep, naturally herd, and it's instinctive to them, and they pick up within days. It's generally the people in charge of them are a bit thicker and a bit slower, and can't really get their head around what it is they're doing. So we're building these fences in advance. We're working on between 3 to 5 day shifts. It's fairly flexible. Also, we're working through the Christmas period, the New Year period. Some days we want a couple of days off, so we make the break allocation to suit, so it fits in with our lifestyle and families and other commitments. But and that's the beauty of having these EFAs or cover crops in place. We can hammer them a little bit harder. We can use them as a release valve in the system for the management. But when we get back onto the cash crops, then we have to really start nailing entry heights, exit heights, time on the ground, and get that right. Because the last thing I want to do is sacrifice the potential of the arable crop for the guy I'm working with. I mean, that's not going to get me ass back in a big hurry. So we're very, very mindful of that. And from the data we're getting back for yield monitors of combines, there is no compromise on tons per hectare getting harvested. And going back to maybe kind of a bigger picture here, Johnny, I'm going to divert ever so slightly. We've just come down from the Highland Show. There was an announcement there about they're not going to relicense Azulux in Scotland. I think it's the same in Wales for bracking control. That gives the upland guys a real headache in terms of managing landscapes, the word I'm after. And when you look at the nature of a sheep, a sheep is kilo for kilo is more productive than a Holstein dairy cow in terms of milk yield, live weight, output from lambs. She's a massively productive, a highly tuned animal, and yet we stick it on hillsides. And you can't easily manage hillsides with sheep in a tight rotational regenerative grazing style. You just can't do it. You can't get enough high quality energy and protein into them. So it makes a huge amount of sense to start taking sheep from these bigger hills and dropping them into an arable system where you have depth of soil, you have quality of nutrition. You then get to express the genetic potential of that sheep. You get the win for the arable operation. I think the points these guys have made are absolutely bang on. And it's a win for young guys trying to get into farming because it's an entry point in for somebody that's short of cash or capital. So there's a real win there to get a real quality of individual into this regen farming system. And then you flip back to the hillsides where we operate. It's a great space, but if you want to develop that landscape, build trees, build covers, get pastures flowing and diversity up there, you've got to do that with a cow. And I actually think we've got the system a wee bit the wrong way around, that we've got cattle and arable operations when really it needs to be sheep. I mean, you have cattle and a different style of cattle based further up the hill, working on these rougher, more lignified pastures, because that massive rumen handles all of that. So there's massive potential to get more sheep into arable rotations, without a doubt.
It's interesting, you touched on it earlier on, Joe, and you were saying about expressing genetic potential, and all sheep are not equal. So all sheep will do much better, well, not all sheep, but most sheep will do much better on an arable rotation, clean grazing, better quality of feed. But you see a massive difference putting the right sheep into those systems. So it's a bit like, cattle is the same. You've got, everything will do well if you feed it the best grazing you can. But there are grazing animals, do you know what I mean? Stuff that's been bred generation on generation to take advantage of forage, to be forage-bred sheep, to do well on the system. I think we all farm a different breed of sheep, but we probably farm very similar kind of sheep. And I think that's one thing. When we first started doing the regenerative agriculture thing, we went in with mules, North Country mules, just large, because it was what was there. Someone had bought 2,000 North Country mules and was like, put these in a mob, 2,000 sheep in a mob, moved every day, round GS4, lamb them in a massive mob, move them every day during lambing, and that really sort of sorted out the good from the bad mules. By the time we eventually got rid of the mules, we'd probably cut 2/3 of them out as culls, and we'd found a good 1,000 mules. We won't farm mules anymore. We farm wool shedders. Joe farms Romneys, and we all farm. What do you farm, Alex?
I'm actually creating a composite just to be different. So
just to be awkward.
Just to be awkward. Yeah, but the point actually is that we spend a massive amount of time trying to fit the animal round, fit the system around the animal.
Got to fit the animal around the system.
We've got to fit the animal around the system, and that's a fundamental mind shift change. That we as land managers have got. Every pastoral system, every grazing system in the world has a predator. There's an apex predator. We have to be the wolf.
And that's us, yeah.
And that's us. And you've got to get your head around this. Stockmen like looking for the best one. Just ignore the best one. You want a flock of grey animals, the ones that turn up every day and do a job, and you want your job is to shut the gate in the last 5.
Yeah, it's the best sheep are the ones that you don't remember.
Yep.
Because you've never had to do anything with. And I think yeah, if you spend all your time chopping the bottom away. So that's all we've ever done. Is if it doesn't fit the system, it gets killed. And that means from if it doesn't do well, a body condition score, to if it keeps jumping over electric fences and running down the road and taking its mates with it, it just gets killed. And
eaten.
Yeah, eaten.
Put in the freezer, I think is what he means.
Yes, yeah. But it's exactly as Alex said. It's about fitting the livestock around the system, And it's interesting when you do this sort of mob stuff because they're all together. You kind of you look at them in a mob system with their lambs. Some lambs do better, some lambs do worse. It's not the system. It's just because some of them are crap mums and some of them are good mums, and some of them will lose their lambs in that mob system, moving every day, and some won't. And over time, close flock, eating the worst, not killing them. You find those better animals by finding the worst animals, and I think that's really, really important, is to get the right stock, because otherwise you are kind of pushing water uphill, and everything will do well, but you see so much better sort of returns by putting the right stock in.
And can I just jump in, and it is a blatant plug, but most of you have got one on your seat. If not, you come as is. But seriously, with breeding, people are just grabbing any animal. Oh yeah, this'll do you. But what it's been bred to do is important, and you will see that. So you're doing your own. We've been doing it for 10 years. We've been deliberately working on an animal that fits that. It'll eat any cover crop, blah blah. So you do have to pay attention to what you're using and where you've got it from and what their selection criteria and things are. In our newest brochure, we have a nice little bit about what actually makes a good breeder, and there's a massive difference between buying something off of your mate next door, kind of cheap, and actually setting yourself up to win with the right animals in the first place. And it just makes a huge difference.
I think there's also got to be a measure of expectation that this is a phenomenal show. In my mind, it's the best networking event in the country when it comes to inspiring. What the Cherry family have done here to pull all us together to learn is just phenomenal. And you go back home absolutely buzzing. But on Monday morning, you've got to wake up with a little bit of expectation that if you decide to jump into this style of business and change what you're doing, it will take 5 to 10 years. It just does, because you have to change soils, you have to change the natural landscape.
Disagree. You can run, if you start with the right stuff, if you're not trying to, you're perhaps meaning convert what you've already got,
the
shit in the field.
Let me finish what I was going to say. When you take the genetics you've got, it will take you several generations to get them where you want them to be if you have not got the right genes to start with. So
fair enough, okay, yeah. So but sell them. Don't try and bash that drum for 5 years. Get rigged, get start again.
It's not true, because there is a percentage within your flock that will cope exceptionally well, right? So again, be the wolf, identify those that don't work. If you want to source new genetics, go see Jo. She seems to have a phenomenal brand of sheep. Then source some new ones from her. But just watch the expectation. This doesn't happen overnight. It takes a few years to transition in, and you need to learn yourself. You're going to make mistakes. Embrace the mistakes. Success is built from the number of failures that you have. Don't make the same mistake 3 times. That's a bit stupid. Do it twice. That's okay. But manage your expectation, and you'll get there, and it works.
I heard a great quote the other day, and it was from an Aussie, and it was, and I apologise for swearing, it was, "Fucking up is just a side effect of having a go." And that's kind of like, when you first start doing these things, and you kind of have to learn it. Like we first started mobbing up the sheep into massive mobs. Sheep get out. A very large mob of sheep getting out is a different thing than a very small group of sheep getting out, and it took us a few years to, like you said, to learn the system, to understand how it works from our point of view as well.
I think if your sheep can keep going out, you need a better fencing brand. So come and see me at the Power Pasture stand down the road. We'll sort you out and make sure they stay in for you.
You've just got to watch the cost of my version versus your version. Like, doing that over those 5 years, that is a long time. If you're paying rents to people, you're paying for those cover crops in that time, you're pushing that water uphill, that can be pretty soul destroying for those 5 years. You seriously should do your figures at the start and see, would I be better to clear out and start again versus that long 5 to 10 year drag.
The bit we're not discussing here, actually, and I think is really fascinating, you were discussing animals into arable operations. But what we're actually doing is managing microbiomes. And that's the trick. I mean, arable guys is about cash crops, it's rotations. Well, it's not so different from what the beef and sleep game, or the beef, I wish it was sleepless now, to be honest. The beef and sheep game does, but we're actually managing microbiomes, and that's a transition of the soil, the genetics, and ourselves to get that nutrition cycle working. And it's microbiome management we're actually in, but we don't see it at that microscopic level. We're kind of taking a highbrow view above it, and we need to be a little bit deeper.
Can we do questions from the audience? Do we have any microphones out there? Excellent. Are there any? Is there anybody in the audience who would like to ask a question of our esteemed panel here? We've got one just about there.
Hi everyone. I put sheep.
Could you stand up when you ask a question?
Hi. Sorry, I'm a mixed farmer, South Wales. I put sheep on my arable when it was 3-leaf winter cereals this year, but I put my ewe lambs on there. And they just ended up really shitty. And I was just wondering whether, I've got Romneys, they're not yours, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to buy rams from you. You sold it really well. But I think, I was wondering why that happened. And I was like, I had to then dag them all. I think it just went straight through them. I like the idea of taking the 3-leaf down. I think that's very neat. But I'm not sure the work on dagging was worth it. So I was wondering whether that's a normal issue.
I was going to say, it's not an issue if you've got wool shedders. So we have an eternal, I love Jo Dealey and I love her Romneys, but we keep wool shedding sheep and they don't get shitty, they don't get dirty, they don't get dags. I've never dagged one of them in my life because they don't have any wool to dag. So it's also the Romneys, you know, I'm not saying about your sheep, but you know, I've seen plenty of your sheep, they don't go daggy on the winter cereals, you know, it is. Like dags are another genetic thing, you know, hence the dag scoring and stuff like that. You know, some sheep will get daggy, some sheep won't get daggy. It's kind of that simple, really.
It's also the speed at which you change that diet. And if that crop if it's a mild autumn and it's really growing fast, that is effective. You know, you're putting on, that's like lush spring grass. So you can't expect that gut to always change that quickly. It's not something we see in ours because I think they're really used to that system, but you can always just, father-in-law would say, put a bale of hay in the corner and let them balance that diet for a couple of weeks as they transition over.
Microbiome. And another big point worth noting is that when you guys are obviously down here, we're 400 miles further north, and it's a different environment and different climate. You know, we've got a shorter growing season, but yet the system still works. And this misnomer that, oh, well, it's all right from the Scots' point of view, I think they do in England. Well, you know, we're doing it quite successfully. You know, not in North the Forth.
It's no accident that the 3 people on the panel spread over 400 miles. That was I didn't want to have people who were just in one
area. Thank you. Long-term regenerative arable farmer who's put a herbal lay in of 20 hectares. And divided it up for sheep into 2-hectare blocks, but they keep getting through all the time. So if you were in that situation, 300 ewes and lambs on 20 hectares, what sort of size paddocks would you have, and how long would you keep them in each paddock? Mains electric fencer, sort of 6,000 volts, going through 3 strands of wire.
We'd be on 2-hectare blocks for 200 ewes and lambs. If that gives you, I can't work I've been trying to work your sums out, and struggling. But that's the size we would go for. If they're pushing out and there's plenty for them to eat, they're just too tight.
You have to work again. You have to work stock. You have to work stock into a system. So, have they been fenced previously in the past? Yeah. And is your cover crop quite leafy or is it quite stemmy? Herbal. I mean, what's the proportion of leaf to stem? Is it quite diverse?
Not desperately. Not enough leaf as I would want.
Well, that's probably the problem. They've probably grazed off the best bit. Again, it's managing expectations. I wouldn't take out more than 50% of that. And sheep are just not. They just can't process a high lignin diet. It's just not them. And so I would take out 50% and keep them moving a bit quicker. What's your post spacing at?
I can't remember particularly. Quite wide.
Yeah, probably. We generally don't put posts. I'll actually do a fencing demonstration when I get finished this, so we'll come and have a chat. But I wouldn't put posts any further than 8 metres apart, and if they're pushing, pull it back to 4 metres.
And also, you generally find there'll be only a small number of sheep that are leading the breakout. You know, we spend a lot of time sat watching and finding the 1 or 2 animals that are jumping the fence and calling all their mates through. And again, it's a lot of the time there is only 1 or 2 repeat. You know, you go to your sheep and there's always that one that's always out. Just get rid of it.
Did you kill it?
I killed it. I had it for dinner.
And the problem with the 1 or 2 it breaks out, when they see you coming, they'll leg it back under the fence again.
Straight back over the fence.
It basically just sit there with 2, 4, 3 and flatten it.
There's
right.
So
and eat it.
Yeah. So Alex jokes, but it's been done.
And by the way, that's exactly the same with cattle. I mean, you can't shoot them with a 243.
Well, you can.
We had.
Where are we going here, boys?
Just going to say, we had one last week that we didn't know why all the cattle were getting out, and there was one of them that was just licking the electric fence, 6,000 volts, picking it off its thing, dropping it, and then walking through the gap. So that thing's gone to the market. Anyway, next question.
Hi, I'm not a farmer, but we've been doing work on herbal lays and bringing sheep into an arable system. So one of the things that we found was that the sheep were drinking a lot more with the herbal lay, which is great because then the urine is more dilute. But also they were constantly at the fountain, and when we went back into arable, we had some quite compacted areas around the fountain. And obviously, with the beauty of hindsight, we could have moved it around, but I wonder whether either of you had that experience.
So we find that they drink next to nothing on a herbal lay because it's obviously so, you know, the chicory, the plantain, the clover is so full of moisture. When we our biggest probably requirement of water will be we set stock over lambing. We lamb in May. It's pretty hot in the southeast in May, so that would probably be the time period when they drink the most. And if we've got sheep on a herbal lay, same size mob of sheep on just sort of either permanent pasture or ryegrass lay, it's noticeable how much less the sheep usually drink on a herbal lay.
Okay, I'm going to dispute that because we've actually collected the urine and it's a lot more dilute.
Where in the world are you?
So Cambridge.
Yeah. And when was that? When were you studying that? When?
Last 3 years, but also Wales. Bangor.
What do you find, Alex? Do you find they drink a lot more on a herbal lay?
No, I wouldn't have said so. I was a bit interested in the question, but I would say sheep. I mean, if they're lactating, then they're going to drink, and they need water for 9-10 weeks of that lactation. But once the lambs are 8-10 weeks old, they've had 50% in the milk in the first 4 to 5 weeks. So the demand from mums reduced. If the plant's growing and you're getting moisture, that plant's probably 80% moisture anyway. So sheep can get quite a lot from just green leaf. So I'm wondering if it's maybe a mineral or trace element thing.
Well, I would think it's a geography thing because we're here as well, and it has been hot as hell through main lactation the last 3 years. So we've seen, we have Bowsers this time last year. We just couldn't move them fast enough. They were peak lactation. It was 40 degrees.
Yeah.
Thank you. So you graze your sheep on cereals and cover crops through the autumn and spring. where do you then move them to in the summer, and what do you finish your lambs on? Like, how do you fatten them?
So the lambs are finishing on the cover crops, or they'll have finished on the grass. We have a small drawer at weaning, not very big, and then they'll go onto the cover crops after that. So that's what our stock is bred for. You know, that they will finish. They're at sort of 90% R3L, which we have a Tesco's contract. That's what they go for. That's what they pay for. That's what they get. So it's just really straightforward. There's no creep. The only thing that we do give them extra is high mag buckets, because this part of the world, like a lot of the UK, very mag deficient, and that stops us getting any doing the running man come lambing. So that's it.
So you keep them on grass through the summer and then put them back on the...
Sorry, yeah, so they'll lamb on grass. So we basically put half on about February as a pre-lamb rotation to wake the grass up on old, like James has said, country houses around here, 100 acres of parkland around the house. We sort of have that divvied as much as they'll allow, which is not great because they like the look of their house and their big parkland. But we divvy it up to sort of 6 or 7 breaks. Then we put the number of sheep that can cope with that area on, put them round a 6-week rotation, half of them before lambing, then bring the other half in off cover crops that are preceding things like borage that allow us to graze them a bit later, or maize or something like that. Put them on. They'll all lamb on that at a set stock. Then after the first cycle, we mob them up, rotate them on that permanent pasture till weaning. Normally by then we're pretty burnt up, so the ewes stay on there. We'll have some herbal lays shut up for the lambs, and that's where they divvy. And then once, and everything pretty much stays where it is then until the cover crops are ready, which is back to James's point that if people want sheep to come and graze cover crops, what they do with them the rest of the year is important. And there is lots of unused or not very well used grassland around and about, but a little bit extra is always helpful.
Yeah, it's funny as well. A lot of the schemes, you've got a lot of the water catchment schemes that are coming in now. They're putting in cover crops that you can only graze from end of January, that sort of time, you know, and they want you off in Feb. So they want you to graze it for like 2 or 3 weeks. And I had someone seriously say, like, we need 5,000 sheep. We need 5,000 sheep for 3 weeks. But it's £3 to move a sheep on a lorry each way. So you're like, you want me to spend that much money to come and help you graze off these cover crops? This is wonderful. It's just not possible. They were like, oh, just go buy some store lambs. So that kind of, one of the biggest things tied all together is getting that year-round grazing. Like, it's a massive issue. And there's always been like the permanent pasture, but some of these GS4 schemes and stuff have really helped incentivize people to put in some year-round grazing. Because it's a kind of running joke, and anyone who knows me, my sheep are extremely well-travelled. Extremely well-travelled. They have been all over the country. They might go from like the Humber Bridge in Lincolnshire, they might be in Wales, they might be in Essex, they get about a bit. And it would, the only thing that like allows it to function year-round is that sort of grass break, temporary grass stuff.
And the other thing, worth bearing in mind of what unpicked me a couple of years ago was, the abattoirs want sheep in dry. So if you're outside grazing arable crops, covers, rotations, and you're drawing fat lambs off that, and then you're trying to get them in a decker, and you're working away from home, and it's pouring with rain because it has been for 3 or 4 weeks, the works don't want wet lambs in them. And so you need to have a conversation with your field agents, abattoirs, what their expectation is too. And if there's this trend to put more and more lambs and finished lambs within an arable context, you might need a bit of roof space. We in the end were drawing fat lambs an hour and a half from home, having to haul them back to home to stick them in the shed to dry them out, to put them back in a decker, to put them back past where they were. It was just mental. Couldn't get the works to understand this is what we're doing, and then get to March, April, lambs become a bit short in the system, and all of a sudden wet sheep are okay. So these conversations need to be had ahead of time, so you don't get yourself in a bit of a hole and find you're hauling sheep and burning time in diesel more than you necessarily need to.
Yeah, quite right. We had another question just here.
You're talking about slaughtering large...
Could you stand up? Could you stand up so we can see you?
Yeah, you're talking about slaughtering large numbers of sheep, but the sort of market we're looking at would like on-farm slaughtered sheep, if that were possible? And you mentioned getting your rifle out, but what's the reality?
Don't judge me. Don't.
So, lambs that you've shot with a rifle are definitely not allowed into the food chain. That's
they're only allowed for home consumption.
I was going to say, you're allowed to put them in your own freezer and eat them yourself, but you cannot sell those. So the ones that we are eating in the supermarket or that get sold through a farm shop, they've got to be slaughtered properly. I don't think that... Is there any on-farm slaughter down here? In Scotland, there is one on-farm abattoir that actually hasn't operated since COVID down in the borders, but I don't think that's really a particularly likely thing. If anyone went along to the mobile abattoir demo that Pasture for Life were having yesterday, that was fascinating. It is just over the thing there. If anyone wants to go and have a look, we have a big program at Pasture for Life for doing mobile abattoirs. Any other questions?
Thank you. Arable farmer from Gloucestershire. For the last couple of years, we've been grazing our winter cereals with sheep as well. We've got on really well with it. But the only thing we've become aware of, from an assurance point of view, is that a lot of the plant protection products we use aren't approved for grazing. Now, I don't know if any of the growers that you deal with have become aware of this, but any of the autumn herbicides we use are not approved on label for grazing. So before we go around telling everybody about it, we might get ourselves in trouble. I just thought to let you know.
But you would be... It's what you're applying it to, though, isn't it? Your approval is what you're applying it to, and you are applying, say, Crystal or whatever, to Pre-M to your wheat. You're not applying it to grass. So it's hitting the deck, it's hitting the surface, it's then having moisture on it, rain on it before you're anywhere near it with an animal.
It's only really for when we're... Because obviously we graze our winter wheat, our winter barley, and some of our rape. But obviously if you've done, a pre-M, but then if you've done an early post-M in the autumn, and then you're going to start grazing with sheep in January and February, there's probably still residual left. Now it's something that, if we keep quiet about, not many people know about it, but once assurance people start, kicking around, they find these things out.
That is some wonderfully muddy water, isn't it, that issue? But yeah, probably we won't bring it up in a big tent full of people.
Any other questions? No. Okay. Oh yeah, here we are. By the way, it's quite difficult to see here because these lights are shining right into our eyes.
Hello. Hi, Bradley Key, Blade Farming. I'm just interested in how you approach a conversation if you're a livestock farmer looking to get into onto a big arable estate and to graze some cover crop off. How do you start the conversation about finances? What money is being exchanged? And is there an opportunity now for there to be no money exchanged because of what the animal is doing for the ground? And could one day the dial even go the other way?
I think there's definitely a lot of... We have some grazing arrangements where we don't pay because obviously the landlord feels they're getting added benefit and they're getting a kind of like a cost benefit out of us grazing it. But we do pay for a lot of our grazing, and part of the reason is because when it's a straight up, like we find personally, when it's a straight up business relationship, so you're getting paid for something, it just makes it a bit simpler and a bit cleaner. And also right at the end of the year, when it's been rainy and muddy and there's been the odd, issue with a walk on the footpath moaning about something or whatever else, writing someone a cheque, and the last thing that you do is you take your sheep away and then you give them a cheque. All sins are forgotten, and they're quite looking forward to seeing you next year. And it, money makes the world go round, and it would be lovely to get paid to do the grazing, but people like money. It's just kind of how it goes, really.
I tend to find the best way to start a conversation is about midnight at Earthborn Arms, and that's how we've done it. It's just been word of mouth, speaking to people. I think you've got to find people with the same values and shared ethos. And if the people you're working with are not as invested as you are, tread gently until that relationship's built up, there's trust put in place, and they see, again, that's what I talked about, a 3-5 year period. People have got to visualize, we all eat with our eyes. And if you have an arable operation, you haven't done this before, and you're a bit twitchy about getting the cash revenue back from your cash crops, you need a wee couple of seasons, because farming is a super slow process. We would like it all to be faster because it's quite an exciting place to be, but we're only working season for season, so you're going to be 12 months till you really see any uplift.
I think also you made a good point there. So we graze quite a range of cover crops, from quite complicated mixes just through to turnips. Some obviously are quite cheap to establish. Some are quite expensive to establish. So if somebody's going into, some of our landlords have been going into it for the first time, and yeah, they want to know that at least their arses are covered. So initially, the idea that there is going to be some money which is going to pay for the seed, pay for the establishment or whatever, is just something that makes them feel more comfortable throwing their hat in the ring. Otherwise, it could be a great big kind of disaster. And it also, we want our landlords to treat the cover crop as a crop. So we want to grow a really good crop, and if we pay a headage rate, so the better crop you grow, the more sheep we can have for longer and the more money that you get. Because we've gone quite a lot of places where it's been free, but there's not a lot there. There's a lot of area, and again, it costs me to take the sheep there. So I'd rather pay you 25, 30p a head a week and have a really good crop that I'm going to be pulling 200 odd lambs off every couple of weeks to eat. But then, it'd be great if I'm getting it for free, but I've still got to take the sheep there. I've got to pay to get the sheep there away. I've still got to go and do the work. I've got to do all this, and they're just eating a lot of crap, for celia and little else. It's much more beneficial for me to just pay you some money and have a good kind of crop, basically.
I was going to say, I find that there's starting the conversation by offering what you've got and finding out what they've got. At some point, there's going to be a meeting in the middle of value, and often that means paying a small amount for the grazing. Certainly, that's what we found in our system.
Hi, 2 questions really. Catch crop mixes. We're harvesting some vining peas tomorrow. As graziers wanting good land performance, what would you suggest we include in that mix, but also with an eye to the fact it's coming into winter wheat? And also, we haven't really talked about one of the biggest concerns for arable farmers who are keen to start integrating sheep into their system, but are also transitioning, and so they're trying to do min or no till, but also with a soil that it's in its early stages, so hasn't got that organic matter build-up. How do you minimise the impact of spring establishment of cash crops when you're grazing sheep on those covers, and you've obviously got the risk of poaching? Thank you.
So we played round with that system for our transition period, and we finished up at a Missouri drill. I'm not plugging them per se, but we had other drills, and none beat that one. We had lots of side-by-side strip trials, and that really did change our system and how effective the whole sheep in the system were, because we can literally take them off and go straight in. It's an expensive drill, takes a lot of horsepower, but we can manage that on our area. So that solves all the issues of poaching and timing and moisture in one go. So getting the right drill for your land and your system is the first thing to get right. Direct drilling straight in when the stock have come off is difficult, and it is tricky, and you've got to be so careful about how you're moving your water, where you've put your water. You've got to be so careful about if you put any silage in or anything like that, what you're doing, your gateways. It's really tricky, and how much plant you're looking to recover or eat out of your cover crop, because you want something that's going to hold in the bottom, like Alex was talking about earlier. You want something with a really firm bottom to hold them up out of the dirt, depending on what your dirt's like. That can be tricky. and you just don't want to absolutely let the sheep nail it down and then get no regrowth. So you either got to get something that's going to hold them up, or you need something that's going to regrow fast to get your structure back in the top. And as to what mix, we love a bit of sort of brassica and legume, so whatever works seed price and in your rotation, depending on whatever crops you've got in your rotation, we would probably do something like a stubble turnip vetch or a kale vetch, depending on your seed price.
It's interesting you're saying about leaving stuff. So with a lot of those mixed cover crops, one of the wonderful things about them is in with your, we'll put like black oats, vetch, phacelia, other stuff in there, linseed. There's always stuff that the sheep obviously preferentially eat. So we'll push them through, and we'll never bear a field off. Like, we'll never leave a field of just mud. Do you know what I mean? We'll go in, we'll hammer out, the vetches and stuff like that, and then the phacelia will be trampled in, the other stuff, bits of linseed. There's always something there. And as Joe said, they regrow. It's amazing. Like, we do some big bankings. They're near the M4. And they're like big bankings of cover crops. And obviously we break them up into cells and we graze through them. And it's amazing going for you can see, the ones not grazed are very green. And then it goes backwards and gets more green as you go backwards, because the first cells you come out of, the oats have regrown, other stuff's regrown, and so it greens back up. And actually, because you're on their sort of short period, high intensity, and then off, but not hammering it too much, you don't, there's a lot of regrowth time after they've come off. You're not pulling them off like last day of Feb, and then someone wants to get in and drill it ASAP. Do you know what I mean? They've been grazed for a few days, 3 days, that cell, you're out of it, and it's got the rest of the winter to...
I think we've got time for another question.
Hi, morning. Brian from up in Scotland. One of the big hassles we find is watering. Lovely paddocks, lots of squares, but you've got to get water to each one. How do you guys cope with that? Sorry, it's rather simplistic.
We have bowsers as much as we can. We'll run blue pipe from the nearest wherever we can into a trough, into just a plastic trough, and then we'll just move the trough around, or put it in the middle of four squares, so that you just turn the angle and you've got all four covered. So that's or a bowser into a trough that you move, one or the other.
We'd be the same, bowsers, but also we had quite a few years ago, we did quite a big regen project. I think we did 480 hectares split into 6.5 to 7.5 hectare cells. And the water was an issue, like bowsers and all sorts of things. In the end, we bit the bullet and just laid pipe, and every cell had a push-in bayonet connector. I can't remember what they're called. They're the stab-in connectors, and we just had mobile troughs, and you've just got to do it. Do you know what I mean? If you're going to, by the time you've put the infrastructure for the fencing, and especially if it was an owned farm, and this was a project that was going to go on for a while, obviously we didn't own the farm, but that infrastructure, like you're buying acres and you're buying growth. So instead of renting more ground or buying the ground next door to graze your stock, because you're splitting it down and you're getting higher stocking densities and better growth, actually to invest that money into infrastructure, into the fencing, into the water, it's just a kind of bullet that eventually you have to bite. And it made a huge difference from running around the spray tanker, filling up. Like, our biggest mob at one point was a couple of thousand ewes and all their lambs in one mob. They drink a lot of water. I think it was like 5.5, almost 6,000 head of sheep in one mob. It was fucking huge. They drink a lot of water from Bowser. We ended up with a big old dairy tank, and it was just a pain in the arse. And something knocks a pipe out, so by the time we put the water lines in, it made life so much easier, because you're just sticking a little trough on the back of the quad bike, just towing it to the next cell, which is only over there, plugging it in, and away you go. And that really, it revolutionised things. So it's worth putting the infrastructure in, definitely.
I mean, getting fencing right gives you influence over a landscape. Nailing the water gives you control. And water tends to be looked at as a secondary thought. It's really got to be the primary thought. And the beauty of working with sheep in arable systems is you just don't need the pipe size you need for dealing with cattle. If we were working with a comparable livestock density of cattle rather than sheep, you're sticking in 50 to 32 mil pipe into that just to get the volume of water, especially in hot days when they're consuming maybe 100 litres a head. You can get away with 20 to 25 mil pipe for a mob of sheep that size.
There's also
and a couple of troughs. So, Brian, just spend a few pounds.
And as Joe's touched on as well, there are lots of kind of countryside stewardship options and stuff like that which will pay some of the infrastructural costs. So there are ways around having to put your hand in your own pocket. Do you know what I mean? There are like the fencing. Do you know what I mean? The stewardship stuff has meant there's an awful lot of farms getting fenced now. You know, and so that's a huge benefit.
But also the big one with sheep actually is make sure the water's clean. Your cattle you can get away with to a point with water it's not overly flash. You know, I mean I'm a bit slow in the go this morning, but generally when I'm moving troughs and moving stock, I'm always testing the water as I go and drinking it myself. Just to make sure is it clean. Sheep will not drink dirty water. They just won't. They refuse. So you've got to make sure your water for sheep is properly potable, properly clean. And if you're not happy with it yourself, don't expect them to drink it because they won't.
Okay, thank you all. I think we've got time for a final word from each of our panelists, and then at 10 o'clock.
You go first.
And then at 10 o'clock, Alex is doing a fencing demo about 100 yards that way, so you can follow him down if you want to learn all about fencing. What would be the one thing that you think is most important to get started?
You need to buy Kaiapoi stock.
Excellent.
I think it's probably just having the right attitude and having a kind of like, it's okay, we're going to have a good go at this, we're going to have an experiment, it might work, it might not work, there's going to be things to learn, and just going into it with a relatively open mind and giving it a good go and accepting that it's always going to be a learning curve, do you know what I mean? And every farm's different, and you can sit there and listen to people talking about this sort of stuff, but you've got to go and apply it on farm and then tweak it to suit your system and your life, because we all have, like you were saying about Christmas Day, you know, we all have different kind of like pressures on us as well, and we forget that. So it's designing a system that suits the farm and yourself.
Yeah, I'm not in the mood for any sort of high floating points right now, but I think it's just what these guys have touched on. You know, you need the right stock and the right system. You've got to design the system. You've got to have a flexibility of mindset and attitude. You can't go into this style of farming with a prescripted mentality. So, you know, just loosen the shackles a little bit, be a little bit free, and you're going to have to respond to a problem you never saw coming or didn't visualize. Just don't flap. You know, you're going to get a few things wrong. It's amazing how Mother Nature recovers when it does go a bit wrong. Don't get too hung up on that, but just have the confidence to get stuck in and give it a go.
And if you've got 10,000 acres of cover crops in the southeast of England, please come and see me afterwards.
And if you need a great fencing product from clothing, come and see me as well.
And someone up here apparently sells Romneys.
Well, I think that's great. Thank you all for coming. Just do it.